Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading part 3 of Unburdened by Conscience, the slave family breakups, how they broke our families apart, and why they make fun of us for not having fathers. This should be an interesting read.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
The Humane Homebreaker in Slavery Historiography. In Africa, the stability of the Black family periodically might have been disturbed by a calamity of nature, but in the antebellum South, the stability of the family was in constant jeopardy. The slaveholder decided the slave family's fate. First and foremost, the slaves had to satisfy the economic needs of their owners, and their existence as a family unit was precarious because the slave family's survival was dependent upon those needs. The head of the family, whether mother or father, understood this. Many slaves feared the threat of sale for good reason. Slave owners might approve of a family and might even have promised not to separate it, but most would have broken that promise at any time if there were a chance or a change in financial plans. The slaveholder's respect, if any, for the Black slave family took a back seat to his pecuniary interests or his financial interests. Much of American slavery historiography expresses the fallacy that the typical slaveholder lived a contradictory double role of patriarch and estate manager. One view among historians was that the slaveholder took into account two separate considerations when breaking up a slave family, a moral one and an economic one. This view depicts a perplexed master experiences a crisis of conscience, a slaveholder suffering psychic agony and torment caused by two constantly warring considerations. Some American slavery historians have argued that because the master's role as a patriarch left him morally concerned about the stability of his slave families, breaking them up would have been his option of last resort. In the following passage, for example, Kenneth Stamp depicted slaveholders who exercised the option to sell their slaves only under the most financially calamitous circumstances. And the quote goes, "The more conscientious slaveholders made great financial sacrifices to avoid dealing with the speculators. Some patriarchal masters in Virginia and elsewhere lived on the edge of bankruptcy rather than seeking solvency through the sale of all or part of their quote unquote people. Other masters, more concerned about social prestige, feared to lose rank by marketing bondsmen. When necessity dictated sales, masters often gave convincing evidence of the distress this misfortune caused them. The majority of slaveholders agreed that only the most calamitous circumstances would justify dealings with professional traders. Perhaps only a few masters wished to regard slaves as marketable commodities. So he's trying to clean up the business of slave trading. He's trying to wipe away the stain. He's trying to make white people feel good about it because they were taking care of their quote unquote people. But that's a modern day term. At the time, they considered us as slaves, as property, as chattel, as cows and horses. Among other historians, Stamp maintained that the slaveholder response to public opinion and his own moral conscience tried to convince his community of the appropriateness of selling his slave by persuading the community that the slave was disobedient. In Stamp's view, the master's rationalization might have protected him from loss of public esteem, but it did not always satisfy his troubled conscience. The notion that a troubled conscience burdened the typical slaveholder is entirely conjectural. Though it's certainly true that the master's public relations strategy was to protect the appearance of being humane, but concrete evidence that slaveholders routinely sold slaves away from their loved ones for material gain belies the claim that their consciences were troubled. In fact, Stamp found that most slaveholders adopted an extremely broad definition of economic necessity, and that somehow their necessities kept the auctioneers busy and enabled the traders to conduct a thick traffic in human flesh. As did Stamp, Leslie Howard Owens depicted slave owners who mulled over moral considerations before selling their slaves. Noting an 1855 legislative proposal in North Carolina requesting that the parental relation be acknowledged and protected by law, and that the separation of slave parents from their young children be strictly forbidden under heavy pains and penalties. Owens wrote, "Though such memorials were frequent, legislators never heeded them, for their implementation would merely have served to increase the moral question that bothered many slaveholders." Despite offering little support for his claim, Owens regarded the slaveholders typically showed concern when reaching the decision to split up a Black slave family because the practice ran counter to what they felt to be right. Nonetheless, he acknowledged that the odds against survival of the slave family were formidable. Eugene Genovese also contended that selling slaves from their families did not rest easy on the master's conscience. He wrote, "Many slaveholders went to impressive lengths to keep families together, even at the price of considerable pecuniary loss. Although, as Kenneth Stamp forcefully insists, the great majority of slaveholders chose business over sentiment and broke up families when under financial pressure, but the choice did not rest easy on their conscience." Genovese was unable to accept that in considering the sale of a slave, generally speaking, expectation of profit or loss was the master's sole criterion. He insisted that the slaveholder operated within an economic sphere and a moral sphere, and in the face of market pressure, he felt guilty about his inability to live up to his own paternalistic justification for slavery. Masters, Genovese argued, could not afford to be wholly indifferent to slave sensibilities. For the most part, however, they were wholly indifferent. Henry H. Butler, a former slave from Virginia, recalled that slaveholders expressed no compassion when a slave sale or trade was at hand. He saw the separation of husbands from their wives, the separation of children from their mothers, and the extreme grief of those from whom family members were snatched and sold away. Butler also observed slave owners bullwhipping those grieving slaves for neglecting their work. Perhaps Eugene Genovese claimed that masters experienced great conflict and torment when selling their slaves because he believed the paternalism propaganda. He wrote, "No other issue so clearly exposed the hybrid nature of the regime, so clearly pitted economic interests against paternalism, and defined limits beyond which the one could not reinforce the other. The problem and the contradiction it called forth therefore remained, and so did the agony." So they're trying to again get you to sympathize with these Southern planters, these slave owners, in an attempt to get you to see their point of view. Like his contemporaries, Genovese did not question that slaveholders experienced agony and torment when separating slave family members. Yet, faced with solid evidence, he conceded, as did his contemporaries, that many masters did not respect their slave families' feelings and did not hesitate to sell slaves individually. Separation of slave family members through sale was an integral part of the American slavery regime. It was resorted to by the heartless masters and those whom the white community might have seen as more humane. Writing over 75 years ago, Frederick Bancroft, who lived from 1860 to 1945, noted that even slaveholders of high standing who needed money sold their best slaves because they brought the most money. It was the money, wrote Bancroft, not the purchasers or the slaves that mattered. In the following passage, he explained that the master concerned with merely projecting the appearance of being humane applied expectation of profit or loss as his criterion in deciding to sell his slave. Virtually everybody preferred to be humane according to Southern standards when it was not financially disadvantageous or inconvenient to do so. Persons whose interests led them to be otherwise naturally wished to conceal the fact or tried to place the blame elsewhere, for there was no respectability without at least the appearance of being humane. But slavery, maintained as a profitable and convenient institution, was essentially ruthless in general and inhumane in some of its main features. Thus, not humanity, but expectation of profit or loss was the criteria. Since the stability of the slave family unit was precarious, dependent on the slaveholder's economic needs, were strong emotional bonds allowed to develop among immediate slave family members? In the next chapter, we will examine the importance of the slave family and determine what role, if any, it played in helping the slave to cope with the daily living conditions under the American slavery regime. The importance of the slave family. The slave family unit was the slave's most important survival mechanism for two reasons. It served his emotional needs and it served his material needs not served by his master. Nathan Irvin Huggins wrote about the atomizing features of slavery. He explained that the forces of the American slavery regime isolated the slave, separated him from his loved ones during the incessant toils of each day, and tried to relegate him to the status of a mere unit of cheap field labor. But the compassion, respect, sympathetic understanding of the slave's suffering, and the love that the slave family offered served as buffers against the brutality of life under the slavery regime. The slaves built strong family ties. They also strove to maintain family stability, allowing their family members to attend to their emotional needs. In no type of American autobiographies is more emphasis placed on the importance of a stable family than in the autobiographies of former slaves, because they went searching for their family members after they were free. From his own painful experience, the former slave Thomas H. Jones wrote about the deep and fond affection which the slave cherishes in his heart for his home and his dear loved ones. Jones had no other tie to link him to human family but his fervent love for those who were with him, in relations of sympathy and devotion, in wrongs and wretchedness. Commenting on the love his slave family gave him, the Indiana ex-slave Dr. George Washington Buckner said that although his family members were not properly housed, nourished, or clothed, they loved each other, loved their cabin homes, and were unhappy when compelled to part. David Bryan Davis provided evidence of the slaves' strong family ties. And he said, the strength of family bonds is suggested by thousands of slaves who ran away from their owners in search of family members separated through sale. The notion that blacks had weak family attachments is also countered by the swarms of freedmen who roamed the South at the end of the Civil War in search of their spouses, parents, or children, and by the eager desire of freed people to legalize their marriages. Adult slave family members worked together, contributing meaningful labor and providing essential material resources for their families. Deborah Gray White correctly concluded that slave families were unusually egalitarian, and by procuring extra provisions for their family was a shared responsibility of bondswoman and bondsman. Although some slaves were well fed by their owners, most were poorly nourished. The master's customary weekly allotment of food for each slave consisted of a peck to a peck and a half of corn ground into meal for cornbread and 2 to 4 pounds of bacon or pork. Some slaves received a jug of molasses as well. The slaves prepared their own food. The typical slave in the antebellum South did not starve to death because long-term hunger would have diminished his productivity. As a general rule, however, his owner gave him inadequate food. The anti-slavery orator Frederick Douglass noted that the 4 slaves his master owned were allowed less than half of a bushel of cornmeal per week and very little else in the shape of meat or vegetables. Lewis Hughes, a former slave, commented on the master's inability to understand that their slaves were undernourished. The idea never seemed to occur to the slaveholders that their slaves were getting no wages for their work and therefore had nothing with which to procure what at times was necessary for their health and strength, palatable and nourishing food. In the United States, unlike much in the Caribbean, more than not, slaveholders did not allow their slaves to grow their own food, but those slaves with whom their masters allowed to grow their own food depended on one another for familial arrangements, laboring together to supplement and vary their families' meager diets with vegetables. Charles Ball wrote about the gardens or patches that some slaves cultivated on Sunday, a day which the majority of slaves had off. Other slave families looked after small gardens on moonlit nights and on Saturday evenings. The master of the Georgia ex-slave Dorcia Harris allowed her family to cultivate a little garden. She recalled that she would go to that family garden in the winter, cut down the collard greens, and after the frost hit, take them to the cabin and boil them for her family's dinner. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. Intent on keeping their slaves totally dependent, other slaveholders prohibited their slaves from profiting from the fruit of labor performed during their time off. So you hear that? They wanted to control their bodies even during their time off. For example, although Celestia Avery's master did not give his slaves much of a variety of food and permitted each slave family to raise its own vegetables, Avery told us that her master always required half of all the vegetables each slave and that it was not permissible for a slave to sell any. So even if you raised the vegetables yourself, you still had to give half to this master. Greetings, Sister Ra. Thanks for tuning in, you and the elders with you. Similarly, according to the Georgia ex-slave George Eason, the produce from the garden that his owner allowed the slaves to cultivate could be used for home consumption only. Under no circumstances could any of it be sold. Though this was generally impermissible, some slaves would steal away from the plantation at night and hunt to provide meat for their families. The male slave's role as hunter and family provider helped him to develop an identity separate and apart from that assigned to him by his master. Josh Horn, an ex-slave from Alabama, remembered, "I's killed in the woods, 'cause us raised children fast, and us had a heap of them, 16 if I remember right, and soon I found out that I could help feed them that way. I done a heap of hunting." Former slaves from Georgia, John F. Van Hook and Georgia Baker, said that the slaves hunted rabbits, squirrels, raccoons, and all kinds of birds, and were especially fond of hunting wild turkeys. The ex-slave, Callie Elder's grandfather, hunted opossum at night, bringing back 2 or 3 at a time. He went fishing as well to supplement the family diet. Bondswomen also hunted to supplement the family diet. "My mama could hunt as good as any man," boasted Betty Brown, a former slave from Arkansas. Her mother traded various animal hides with peddlers for calico prints. When the South Carolina ex-slave Sylvia Cannon's family became desperate for meat and could find nothing else, she made death traps with lids, baited them with cabbage and corn, and caught rabbits and birds. We were survivors, and we still are to this day. As a general rule, slaveholders provided barely adequate clothing for all but provided all but privileged house slaves who made up a small minority of the slave population. The 91-year-old Louisiana ex-slave Louis Love saw very young slave children wearing no pants. And remember, in the previous chapter, they talked about the fact that on some slave breeding farms, they only gave them shirts to wear. And when we think about what Booker T. Washington said when he talked about the itchiness of the clothes that he was given and how inadequate they were, then we can understand the type of clothes that they were given. Henry Johnson said that he never knew what a shirt was until he got over 20 years old. Other slave children did not wear clothes. Most masters gave each adult bondswoman one gown and provided one shirt and a pair of pants for each adult male slave. But we know of a Virginia slaveholder and a Texas slaveholder who did not give their bondsmen trousers. Louisa Everett's recall was that a shirt was all that a male slave had on the McLean plantation. The Texas ex-slave Ben Simpson went naked. He said, "We never had any clothes. Generally, slaves went barefoot in the summer months." According to ex-slave James L. Smith's account, in the winter, the typical slaveholder gave his slaves an overcoat or round jacket and a pair of coarse brogan shoes once a year and a wool hat once every 2 or 3 years. The slave family worked together to provide more clothing for its members. The fugitive slave, James W.C. Pennington, remembered helping his father to make straw hats and willow baskets, by which means his family purchased more articles of clothing. About these, he remarked, "Slaves in the mildest form of the system never get from the master. After bondswomen completed the day's work, they spun, wove, and sold clothes for their families." Mary Edwards, an ex-slave from South Carolina, said, "We made our own clothes, which we done sometimes late in the evening." Nancy Bowdry recalled as well, "Us had clothes, 'cause we spun the thread and weaved them ourselves." David Bryan Davis observed that slave families provided a refuge from the dehumanizing effects of being treated as chattel property. They were invaluable to the slave community because they gave their members the needed love and compassion. Adult slaves contributed meaningful labor and provided essential material resources such as food and clothing for their children. Serving as a family providers allowed the bondsmen and bondswomen to develop identities separate and apart from their assigned roles, the ones assigned by their slave owners, and it helped them to gain a sense of personal autonomy and self-worth. The forecast says, "When I walk the slave trails here where I live, I think about how they had to walk through those paths barefoot, especially in the winter." Absolutely. The breakup of marital unions through slave sales. Historians don't agree on whether or not the slaveholders' practice of breaking up slave marital unions through slave sales was widespread. Fogel and Ingerman maintained that about 84% of the slaves engaged in westward trek migrated with their owners. They argued that the interregional slave trade resulted in the destruction of some slave marriages, but data contained in sales records in New Orleans sharply contradict the popular view that the destruction of slave marriages was at least a frequent consequence of the slave trade. Drawing upon records covering thousands of transactions from the year 1804 to the year 1862, they found that more than 84% of all sales of slaves who were 14 years of age or older involved unmarried individuals. Were they not married because they didn't respect or recognize their marriage? Because we couldn't legally marry. So, are they talking about the people that were virgins? Are they talking about the people that had not laid with anyone? Or are they just saying that they were unmarried because that was the status of their chattel, even though they had been breeding for years? Of those married individuals sold, they noticed that 6% were sold with their spouses, and probably at least a quarter of the remainder were widowed or voluntarily separated. Vogel and Ingerman concluded that 13% or less of interregional sales resulted in the destruction of slave marriages. And since sales were only 16% of the total interregional movement, it is probable that only about 2% of the marriages of slaves involved in the westward track were destroyed in the process of the migration. If we relied on their records, we might reasonably conclude that slaveholders and traders were concerned about the stability of slave marriages. The historian Herbert G. Gutman, who lived from 1928 to 1985, challenged Vogel and Ingerman's interpretation of the New Orleans data. He maintained that the scant information contained in the records kept the slave transfers in interregional markets, such as New Orleans, did not show the effect of sales on either slave families or slave marriages. Gutman determined that the records were incomplete because the slave sale invoices indicated no more than the slave's name, age, and sex. He pointed out the pitfalls of using that evidence as clues to the slave family structure. Even if the data had identified married slaves, it probably still would have been an inaccurate measure of dissolved slave unions because it would not have taken into account unmarried slaves who lived together as lifelong companions. A focus on slaves married in the conventional sense is pointless in any debate over whether or not the dissolution of an antebellum era slave union was a frequent consequence of the slave trade. Held as property, the slaves had no legal capacity to assent to any contract, including the contract of matrimony. Legal marriages, the historian Charles H. Nichols wrote, would have been an offense to the owner's licentious appetite. Sarah Ross, a former slave from Mississippi, told us that enslaved Black men and women in the antebellum South did not marry. They cohabitated, in many cases against their will, as man and wife. The Georgia ex-slave Elsie Moreland recalled that her sister and a male companion just lived together because that's the way they done it in them days. A slave may have referred to his union as marriage, but it is more accurately called cotubarinum, a permitted cohabitation of slaves to which no legal rights were attached. That many of the slaves who were recorded in sale invoices in markets such as New Orleans were not listed as married reveals nothing about whether or not they were bonded in monogamous unions when slave traders sold them. If asked whether or not they were married, some slaves probably would have responded in the negative. For instance, when an interviewer asked Georgia Baker whether she was married or not, she replied, "Lordy, miss, I ain't never been married, but I did live with Major Baker 18 years and us have 5 children together." No doubt Separation from a companion would have been as traumatic for an unmarried bondswoman like Georgia Baker as for one whose sale invoice had indicated that she was married. Studies have been conducted on the effect of slave sales on the slave family, and more specifically slave marriages. In response to Fogel and Ingerman's contention that only 13% or fewer of interregional sales resulted in the destruction of slave families, Herbert Gutman produced statistics of his own that showed a higher percentage of dissolved slave marriages. Using marriage registration books kept by the Union Army clergy in David Ben Natchez and Vicksburg, Mississippi, and recorded in 1864 to 1865, Gutman estimated that 17% of the recorded marriages were broken up by slave owners and trades. He found that an even higher percentage of slaves 20 years and older, nearly 1 in 6 registrants, have been separated from a companion by force, and nearly 1 in 4 men and 1 in 5 women aged 30 or older had suffered such a separation. Forcible separations were significant among younger slaves as well. Gutman estimated that 1 in 10 men and women born in between the years 1835 and 1845 had experienced a forcible separation by the year 1864. From his sources, he found percentages were high enough to conclude that even in the pre-Civil War decades, the peculiar institution retained the grimiest quality, the breakup of marriages, and the damage thereby inflicted on husbands and wives, parents, and children. Other historians have claimed that slave traders destroyed an even higher percentage of slave marriages through slave sales. John Blassingame used a different resource of information, in his opinion, was the best objective evidence found and available, with slave sales responsible for forcibly dissolving 32.4% of Black unions. Peter Coughlin estimated that slave sales broke up 1 in every 3 slave marriages as well. All of these studies considered together suggest that the slave owner and trader practice of breaking up slave marriages was widespread. During the antebellum period, probably between 25 and 33% of all slave unions were forcibly dissolved by slave sales. In their narratives, former slaves tell us that slave trading severed countless marital bonds. The Georgia ex-slave Amanda McDaniel recalled that her mother, Matilda Hale, was snatched from her first husband, sold to a slave trader in Virginia, and eventually sold along with her 2 youngest children to a Georgia slave trader. Sojourner Truth was married to another slave named Thomas, who was twice married previously. One of his wives, if not both, had been separated from him and sold far away. The author who recorded Truth's narrative wrote, and it was more than probable that he was not only allowed but encouraged to take another at each successive sale. Such is the custom among the slaveholders at the present day. The former slave Reginald Ringgold Ward was mindful that marriage must succumb to slavery. Slavery must reign supreme over every right and institution, however vulnerable or sacred. In all the slaveholding states except Louisiana, No restrictions of any kind prevented the violent separation of husbands from their wives or parents from their children. On February 7, 1839, in a speech before the United States, Senator Henry Clay in fact said, "The moment that the incontestable fact is admitted that the slaves are property, the law of movable property irresistibly attaches itself to them and secures the right of carrying them from one state to another." Southern white planters saw owning slaves as a convenient way to move wealth from state to state. Slaveholders and traders separated slave spouses from one another, but more often they separated slave fathers from their children. For the slave husband and father, his removal from a state and separation from his loved ones produced emotionally and psychologically devastating consequences. Charles Ball never forgot the emotional trauma and depression he suffered when his master sold him from his wife and children. In the following passage, he lamented the loss of his family. And he said, "This man came up to me, and seizing me by the collar, he shook me violently, saying I was his property and must go with him to Georgia." At the sound of these words, the thoughts of my wife and children rushed across my mind, and my heart died away within me. I saw and knew my case was hopeless and that resistance was in vain. I was asked if I could not be allowed to see my wife and children, or if this could not be permitted, if they might not leave them to come see me. But I was told that I would be able to get another wife in Georgia. I became very weary of life and bitterly execrated the day that I was born. It seemed that I was destined by fate, to drink the cup of sorrow to the very dregs, and that I should find no respite from my misery but in the grave. I longed to die. More concerned with their economic well-being, many slaveholders were not interested in promoting stable relationships in the slave quarters. The South placed laws on the books elevating slaveholder property interests over slave marital interests. As Southerner R.Q. Mallard wrote, "In too many instances, the marriage relation was broken up, not often voluntarily. Slaveholders severed slave marital bonds in the interest of profit." The master's rationale for encouraging stable slave unions. When masters did promote stable slave marital arrangements, they did not do so out of any moral concern. Generally, slaveholders encouraged slaves to pair up to create more slave labor, maintain discipline and social control, and discourage runaways. As Angela Davis forcefully insisted, bonds they allowed to thrive were for the most part external fabrications serving the designs of a various profit-seeking slaveholder. Many slaveholders who encouraged slaves to marry did so because they knew that pairing off slaves would have ensured a steady supply of new slaves. In 1832, Thomas Ardew explained that the slaveholder's chief rationale for wanting his slaves to marry was to increase his slave holdings. He observed that the ban on the Atlantic slave trade furnished every inducement to the master to attend to his Negroes and encourage marriage, and to cause the greatest possible number to be raised. And thus it affords a powerful stimulus to the spring of Black population. In 1853, Reverend William Goodell noted as well that the masters in the antebellum South licensed their bondswomen to be breeders, not wives. Thus, as Henry H. Butler told us, the most important factor in securing a slaveholder's consent to a slave marriage would have been that the slave owner's desire to rear slaves with perfect physiques. Indeed, we may gather that if a physically robust bondsman were to have requested permission from a slaveholder to marry one of his slave women, eager to own more healthy slave children, the master probably would have granted it without delay. An ex-slave named Andrew Jackson recalled that his master told him to get married according to slavery, or in other words, to enrich his plantation by a family of young slaves. Jackson's sole option was to be sold to a slave trader who was making up a slave gang for market further south. Henry Bibb intimated that his wife's owner gave him permission to marry on the condition that he father slave children. He wrote, Melinda's master was very much in favor of the match, but entirely upon selfish principles. When I went to ask his permission to marry Melinda, his answer was the affirmative, but with one condition, which I consider to be too vulgar to be written in this book. There are some slave owners that said you had to produce 25 children for me, and then upon that 25th healthy child reaching a certain age, then I'll set you free. 25 children. John Blessingame, among others, found some slaveholders avoided dissolving the slave marital unions to maintain discipline. When purchasing slaves, the exceptional, more humane masters, perhaps reluctant to bullwhip their disobedient slaves, were aware of the potential discipline problem the involuntary dissolution of a slave marriage might cause. Concerned that a slave named Dick was likely to be trouble without his family, the slaveholder James Mercer bought the slave's wife and children. Masters also realized that slaves who were emotionally tied to companions were less likely to run away. Chapter 17. The Promiscuous Bondswoman, Myth or Reality. During the antebellum period, was the promiscuous bondwoman a myth or reality? Was the enslaved Black woman actually indiscriminate about her choice of bed partners and guilty of taking on multiple ones? Or was that merely an image created by circumstances having nothing to do with her voluntary sexual activity? Much has been written about the so-called sexual promiscuity of Black bondswomen. Fogel and Ingerman, for example, said that the presence of large numbers of tawny, golden, and white or nearly white slaves was, quote unquote, proof beyond denial of either the ubiquity of the exploitation of Black women by white men or of the promiscuity of Black women, or both. So they were blaming the enslaved women for having all of these mulatto, white, and nearly white children, but they were saying that maybe it was just how did he have it? Maybe it was just the sexual prowess of the white man. Okay. Although it is true that slaveholders encouraged and in many instances, as we have seen, compelled Africans in the antebellum South to increase their slave labor supply by having children. And it is also true that slaves were not allowed to make legal marriage contracts. It appears equally true from the testimony of former slaves that most enslaved blacks did not voluntarily breed promiscuously. If the promiscuous bondswoman was just an image, was that image in the white Southerner's misconception or his invention or a combination of the two? At this point, we should defer to the sharp insight of Deborah Gray White. She attributed what she described as one of the most prevalent images of Black women in the antebellum American South, the Jezebel character, a woman governed almost entirely by her libido, to the fact that bondswomen were often semi-clad. Now remember, we just heard that they barely gave us clothes and sometimes they made us work naked. And so, of course, we were barely clad. White argued that many antebellum white Southerners were influenced by the mid-19th century ideal of the Victorian lady, a respectable white woman covered by layers of clothing and never exposing even her legs and arms to public view without arousing the ire of her husband and the contempt of her community. Based on this ideal, they determined that the bondswoman's semi-nudity was conclusive evidence of her promiscuity, but she had no control over that. Thus, the characterization of the bondswoman as promiscuous was a dubious inference at best. White found that some bondswomen wore tattered clothes, rendering them almost naked, and others were exposed because of the type of work they performed, particularly those slave women on rice plantations who worked in water with their dresses reefed up around their hips, exposing their legs and thighs. Another time at which bondswomen bodies were exposed was when slave buyers examined them on the auction block. An ex-slave from Arkansas named Julia Grace recalled that when slave traders put her mother and other slave women on the auction block, they weighed them, stripped them naked to see if there was anything wrong with them and how they were built, and then bid them off. Having seen many slaves sold on the auction block, Andrew Boone told us they would strip them stark naked. Moreover, before whipping their bondswomen, the slaveholders exposed their bodies. Susan Hamilton's recall was that the master whipped the slave woman with only something tied around her lower part of her body. Amanda Ross, a former slave from Arkansas, similarly said that she saw them tie the woman up, strip her naked to the waist, and whip them till the blood ran down their backs. Simply stated, the typical bondswoman was not willingly indiscriminate in her choice of bed partners. The revealing clothing that she wore may have helped to foster the false, unflattering image of what White called a woman obsessed with matters of the flesh. White maintained that some antebellum white Southerners regarded the high birth rates among bondswomen as evidence of their promiscuity. As previously pointed out, however, many engaged in sexual intercourse against their will. Even the son of a Virginia slaveholder, Moncure D. Conway, was constrained by conscience to write, "I grieve to say that there is too much ground for the charges that general licentiousness among the slaves, for the purpose of a large increase is compelled by some masters." If slaveholders forced bondswomen to procreate under the threat of torture or sale, surely those who labeled them as sexually promiscuous for bearing many children unfairly mischaracterized them. Angela Davis and Gerda Lerner shared the same view on the origin of the image of the promiscuous bondwoman. They insisted that the image, like its twin image, the Black Rapist, was a white Southerner's invention. Southern whites created the promiscuous bondwoman to apologize for and to facilitate their continued exploitation of Black women. Unfortunately, even relatively enlightened observers during the antebellum period misunderstood the sexual attitudes of enslaved Blacks. Current social scientists have misconceptions as well. Since the vast majority of slaves who were brought to America came from West Africa, what, if any, impact did traditional West African culture have on the slave in shaping his attitude towards sex? The scholar Jacques Marquet noted, African sexuality, both in and out of marriage, shows moderation and control. He added, the African idea of sexuality avoids dramatizing and personalizing this activity as we have been taught to do by romantic tradition. Determined largely by extended kinship networks and religious obligations, the Africans' attitude towards sex differed greatly from those now current in Europe at the time. Traditional West African societies viewed sex as normal and something fundamental to procreation and a religious duty to ensure continuation of the family lineage established by their ancestors. Furthermore, since barrenness was a calamity in Africa, a great value was placed on fertility and procreation. Excepting the Hausa and the Nupe of Nigeria, most African societies considered premarital chastity of no importance because they did not regard premarital sex as something dirty or sinful or as an impulse to be suppressed. They accepted it as a normal part of the courtship process. Polygamy was a cultural tradition, but extramarital sex was not tolerated, and, unlike the Southern slaveholding class, traditional West African societies generally forbade incest. But many mid-19th century observers, influenced by Victorian Moors, believed premarital sex to be evidence of the absence of sexual standards and of savage behavior. They found sexual morality synonymous with sexual restraint and considered sex appropriate only after marriage. These views probably helped to create the misconceptions regarding the sexual attitudes of Africans in America as well. For the slaves, voluntary sexual relations were almost always followed by permanent bonds and were hardly evidence of indiscriminate mating. When asked about the proportion of slave women who voluntarily had sexual intercourse before marriage, the ex-slave Robert Smalls replied, the majority do, but they do not consider this intercourse an evil thing. Generally speaking, it was a prelude to a permanent bond, whether or not we chose to call the union a marriage. If the bondswoman's new lover did not accept her as a wife, another man would have to accept her if she had outside children, and the slave community would not have stigmatized those children because of the premarital sexual activity of their parents. Thomas H. Jones, a former slave, understood the value of monogamous arrangements. He wanted a companion with whom he could love with all his warm affection and who would love him in return. His desire for a partner whom he might think when toiling for a selfish, unfeeling master who would dwell fondly on his memories when they were separated during the severe labors of the day, and with whom he might enjoy the blessed happiness of social endearments after the work of each day was over. Lewis Clark, a fugitive slave from Kentucky, saw many bondswomen sobbing and crying for their mates sold into slavery in the Deep South. Married or unmarried, slaves developed strong emotional ties with their partners and consequently lamented the loss of their beloved companions. Driven purely by materialism and blind to the misery consequent upon the arbitrary destruction of such unions, many masters simply compelled the unfortunate spouses to take other partners or suffer the consequences of torture or sale. William Wells Brown wrote that slaveholders who sold slave husbands from their wives and compelled the wives to take other husbands. When he asked a slave woman named Sally why she married a slave man named Peter so soon after they had sold her first husband, she replied, "Because master made me do it." Generally, if a slave lost a spouse, he would have mourned for that some companion and would not have married soon after unless driven by want. Eventually, the slave might have found a new partner. The South Carolina ex-slave Sylvia Durant recalled that a slaveholder sold her uncle's wife and a speculator carried her mother's first husband off, but both her uncle and mother eventually remarried. Thomas H. Jones undoubtedly experienced bitterness and agony when a slaveholder separated him from his first wife and children, but out of a yearning for affection, he took another wife. He wrote, "The memory will find a fresh impression on my heart while that heart shall beat. I passed 4 years, and I began to feel that I could not live in utter loneliness any longer. My heart was still and always yearning for affection and loving communion. I asked Mary R. Moore to come and cheer me in my desolate home. She is now my wife and is with me today until death do us part." Having lost a longtime companion through sale, even the most committed of slaves understood the value of monogamous unions as important survival mechanisms. Many slaves were driven by want to find new partners. However, they could not rest assured that those unions would never be severed by the sale of their new mates. Interviewed in the 1850s about his separation from his wives, a slave named Weldon of North Carolina said, "I had 12 children with my first wife. I got her when I was 16, and I lived with her for 24 years. Then they sold her and all the children. 5 years later, he and another woman jumped over the broom, but he lived with that wife a little more than 3 years when his master sold her away." The slaves' personal accounts are testament to the importance to them of such monogamous unions and to the emotional damage inflicted on slave partners who were separated from each other through sale. The breakup of slave families. She is a mother pale with fear. Her boy clings to her side, and her little vanity cries, his trembling form to hide. He is not hers, although she bore for him a mother's pain. He is not hers, although her blood is coursing through his veins. By Frances E.W. Harper, excerpt from The Slave Mother, Poems on Miscellaneous Subjects, published in 1854. Undoubtedly, the domestic slave trade destroyed innumerable slave families. Slaveholders created an intricate system of domestic slaves trading before the demise of the Atlantic slave trade. In the last half of the 18th century, it was well developed, particularly in the Atlantic seaboard states of the Carolinas, Maryland, and Virginia. The historian Frederick Bancroft cited advertisements in daily newspapers as evidence of that development. On February 25th, 1796, Charleston, South Carolina newspaper, for example, contained 14 slave sale ads about the public or private sale, hiring or purchasing of 288 slaves, and not one of those slaves came directly either from Africa or another state. In his study of Maryland slaves, Alan Kulikoff found that even on large plantations, social life was insecure and slaves were sold away from their loved ones. He estimated that about 20% of all slaves in southern Maryland left the region between the years of 1755 and 1782. The greatest demand for slaves came from Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, as well as Georgia, Tennessee, and Missouri. In Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, where slaves found labor less remunerative, they deemed the rearing of slaves for sale most important. As Frederick Bancroft pointed out, after 1820, which is after slavery, the transatlantic slave trade became illegal, the decline in the value of land and crops, except for the best tobacco, was so great in Virginia that only the demand for Virginia leaf and the sale of surplus Negroes, rapidly increasing in price, to the southern cotton planters enabled the inhabitants to keep the wolf from the door and to maintain a semblance of their former hospitality. So it became a much more savage market. They were looking for more slaves, and the tobacco from Virginia was just as popular and just as expensive as the slaves. At the end of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, in the District of Columbia, the increase in slave prices gave more economic incentive to shrewd calculating slaveholders, and they increasingly sold from their slave families the members reared among them. In the South, the period from the 1820s forward was conducive to selling slaves. If the slaveholders overlooked that fact, the slave traders constantly reminded them of it. Again, as Frederick Bancroft wrote, when a slave when the slave owners did not seek out trades and request that high price in cash, the impatient traders went to the markets to look for masters that might be tempted. A Southwestern trader would give much more cash for a prime field hand or a young woman with one or two children than the average Maryland or Virginia farmer could save from years of agricultural labor. And selling at such a time enabled the vendor to explain matters at home and suit himself, so he could wash away and cleanse his conscience by the amount of money he was getting for these enslaved people. But remember, sometimes these enslaved people were even his own children, because he had been raping the enslaved women to make more babies, to make himself more profitable. Domestic slave trading actually reached its peak in the 1830s. During that period, the slave population in Maryland decreased by about 13%. If we look at the census figures for the state for the period from 1830 to 1840, we can see the effect slave trading had on that population. 18 of 19 Maryland counties for which we have data experienced decreases in the slave population. The total decrease was over 14,000 slaves. The following are the census figures for those counties. The counties included are Allegheny, Anne Arundel, Baltimore, Calvert, Caroline, Cecil, Charles, Dorchester, Frederick, Hartford, Kent, Montgomery, Prince George's, Queen Anne, St. Mary's, Somerset, Talbot, Washington, and Worcester. In 1830, those counties had 102,994 slaves. In 1840, they had 88,615 slaves. William Calderhead conducted a study of slave sales for the years from 1830 to 1840 in 8 Maryland counties. The slave population of those counties in the year 1830 totaled 46,840. He found that during the 10-year period, 1,991 slaves involving the sale of 5,073 slaves occurred. Having interpreted Calderhead's study, Herbert Gutman concluded that the volume of sales had an effect on the slave family, but the exact effect could not be known. If the average slave family in 1830 had 4 members, wrote Gutman, then there were 17 sales per 100 families and 43 slaves sold per 100 families. The state of Virginia led all Atlantic seaboard states in the number of slaves traded. Although the Virginia slave population decreased by only about 4% during the same 10-year period, the total decrease was more than 20,000 slaves. So 4% of that population was more than 20,000 slaves. In fact, Ken Stamp estimated that in the last 3 decades of the antebellum era, nearly 300,000 Virginia slaves were transported to the Deep South. During the Virginia legislative debates of 1832 concerning the abolition of slavery, both slavery proponents and abolitionists agreed that slave rearing was a common means of profit, and slave traders took thousands of Virginia slaves to the Southwest. Addressing the legislature, Thomas R. Dew said, "From all the information we can obtain, we have no hesitation in saying that upwards of 60,000 are yearly exported to other states." He added, "Virginia is, in fact, a Negro raising state for other states. She produces enough for her own supply and 6,000 for sale." Frederick Bancroft estimated that between the years of 1830 and 1840, Virginia's yearly export of slaves was almost twice that. He found that the state annually exported approximately 11,800 slaves. Although much of the growth of the slave population during that 10-year period was quote unquote natural, and in large part the result of the slaveholders' practice of slave breeding, While the Maryland and Virginia slave population decreased, the slave population further south increased. The Georgia and Tennessee slave populations grew by about 30%, and Louisiana's grew by more than 50%. The slave populations in Alabama and Missouri more than doubled. The slave population of Mississippi increased almost threefold, and the one in Arkansas grew almost more than fourfold. We know that slaves imported from Maryland and Virginia constituted much of the increase in those populations. Forecast says, we talk about the Trail of Tears with Indian, but for us, it was a trail of tears sending us to the South after removing the Indians. Yes, it was. After they bred us on those plantations deliberately by all vile manner of reproductive processes, whether they bred us to our uncles, whether they bred mothers to sons, uncles to nieces, or they just flat out raped us. After that, then they sent us south. That the states of Maryland and Virginia annually exported thousands of slaves suggests that slaveholders were not adverse to breaking up slave families for profit, and that the number of families destroyed by sales was sufficiently high to inflict emotional trauma on thousands of slave family members. Indeed, Charles H. Nichols correctly observed that perhaps the most inhuman phase of the slave trade was the unavoidable separation of slave families. Although slaveholders, other defenders of the American slavery regime, and even some social scientists have denied its widespread occurrence, the selling of slave children from their families was a disturbing fact of slave life. Since most slaveholders viewed the birth of a slave child as an economic event, the time at which they sold slave children from their families depended not on the child's psychological or emotional preparedness for separation, but on their stability, the economic needs of the slaveholder, and the degree of market pressure. So on their saleability, the economic needs of the slaveholder, whether or not they needed money, and the degree of market pressure, how much money could they get for them. Peter Colchin estimated that almost half of all slave children were separated from at least one parent. The practice of separating them from their families was most frequent following the death of a slaveholder and during periods of financial distress. The slave parents could do nothing to prevent it. In fact, the South Carolinian observer Angela Grimke Weld noted that they had as little control over the sale of their children as have domestic animals over the disposal of their young. Charles Ball's mother and several of her children were sold to separate purchasers upon his master's death. The former slave Lunsford Lane recalled that his master sold a number of her slaves from their families and friends and sold several children from their parents after his master died. Sister Ross says, the Mississippi land forks in the land road. We went there a long time ago. Many negative vibes went through her, and she said she had a feeling, she felt them. So Sister Ross felt the spirits of the ancestors that traversed the Mississippi land because they were separated from their families and they were they were in agony, having been torn from their families at such a young age, having been sold up and down the river. And some of them didn't stop in Mississippi. It carries over to the Caribbean as well. That's where they sent the really rowdy slaves. Another time at which slaveholders separated slave children from their families was when they gave them away as bridal gifts to their children. Dr. George Washington Buckner's sister was given away as a bridal gift to his master's daughter. When asked how he felt about it, Dr. Buckner replied, "It always filled us with sorrow when we were separated either by circumstance of marriage or death." Other slaveholders threatened to sell slave children from their parents to maintain discipline and control. A former slave from North Carolina, Clara Jones, informed us just after she bore her fifth child, she fell out in the field, apparently from exhaustion. She said that her master ain't had but 50 slaves, but he makes them do the work of 150. Her owner went out to the field, kicked her, and warned her that if she didn't get up and work, he was going to sell her 10-month-old baby. She said, "You Fork in the Road." Google it. I will look up "You Fork in the Road." Give me a moment. I certainly will. How did the slavery community deal with the parentless slave child? Similarities can be seen in the adaptive mechanisms traditional West African societies made use of during the absence of a child's parent. Now, I will interject here that I think one of the reasons we have so much missing history is because there's a significant number of enslaved children that were sold away from their parents. And so that history and that memory that goes from mother to child wasn't able to get passed down because the person that was raising you might have been an 8-year-old and they didn't have anything other than what the master had passed down to them, which was that good old religion. So they broke the bonds that tied us to Africa on purpose and deliberately by selling us as children away from our parents. In traditional West African societies, the concept orphan generally did not exist. In the event of a parent's death, an African child only had to mingle in his village to see several relatives who would have substituted for his mother, father, brothers, and sisters, and they would have treated him accordingly. The slave community retained those West African adaptive mechanisms. In the slave quarters, there were many children separated from their parents, siblings, or other relatives. Under those circumstances, familial arrangements in the slave quarters worked against isolation. As a matter of course, unattached children were assimilated into other slave families. Although acceptance by other families in the slave quarters probably helped the child to adjust, it probably did not mitigate the initial emotional trauma of being separated from parents and other loved ones. Delia Garlick had 13 siblings but knew only one. Her masters separated her from them all and eventually sold her from her mother. She said, "Babies were snatched from their mother's breasts and sold to speculators. Children were separated from sisters and brothers and never saw each other again." When asked whether or not the children cried when they were separated, Garlick replied, "Of course they cry. You think they not cry when they was sold like cattle? I could tell you about it all day, but even then, you couldn't guess the awfulness of it. Certain slave children might have been sold only a few miles away, but when slaveholders sold them, their destinations were routinely concealed from their parents. It would have been difficult for their parents to find them, for the names of slaves were commonly changed with every change of their owners. Moses Grandy observed, slaves usually hear the name of the master to whom they belong at the time. They have no family name of their own by which they can be traced. Although ownership of the slave child belonged to the owner of that child's mother, and though the mother was less likely than the father to be separated from her children, that should not diminish the fact that slaveholders frequently separated slave children from their mothers. James L. Smith recalled that the first cruel act of his master was to sell his sister Celia. He noted that his mother did not utter a word, but bore this shock in silence, but bitter anger and agony. Harriet Jacobs saw a slave mother lead 7 of her children to the auction block. She wrote the following. She knew that some of them would be taken from her, but they took all. The children were sold to a slave trader and their mother brought by a man in her town. Before night, her children were all far away. She begged for the trader to tell her where he intended to take them, but he refused to do so. How could he when he knew he could sell them one by one wherever he could command the highest price? I met that mother on the street, and her wild, haggard face lives today in my mind. She wrung her hands in anguish and exclaimed, "Gone, all gone. Why don't God kill me?" I had no words wherewith to comfort her. Instances of this kind are daily, yea, of hourly occurrence. Since the breakup of the slave family was a function of economics calculated in money and goods, the best plan for effecting good sales was to put up each slave child separately at auctions, sometimes giving a few days' notice. Frederick Bancroft found that the selling singly of young children privately and publicly was frequent and notorious. Moses Grandy, for example, informed us that although one of his sisters was sold away from her husband with an infant at her breast, 4 of her 6 children were sold away one at a time. William Wells Brown's mother and all of her children were sold to different slaveholders in the city of St. Louis. Frederick Bancroft observed that, excepting slave mothers and their small children, and often only some of them, it was common for slaveholders and slave traders to divide slave families. He wrote, when it was expected to be markedly advantageous, the everyday practice in selling slaves to pay debts and settle estates was to divide families, often excepting mother and children. The fact that the law did not prohibit such separations, but sanctioned and even compelled them when parties in interest demanded them, that the interstate traders were suspected of intending to divide families when they had advertised for them, that all but a small percentage of slaves they had for sale were single or young mothers with small children, and that the slaves in the markets, unless in gangs from estates, were almost exclusively of the same kind. These and many other facts to be duly noticed are conclusive evidence that it was common to divide slave families. His conclusion finds support in the testimony of former slaves Sarah Bird, a Virginia ex-slave, that said, "Child, in them days, so many families were broke up and went one way and the others went the other way, and you never seen them no more. Virginia was a regular slave market." Lewis Clark was thoroughly convinced that the slaveholders minded no more selling children away from a slave than they did calves from a cow. One slave mother named Charity worked years to buy her son from his mistress, only to be told by the mistress that she had sold him. She recalled the following: "I wanted to keep the right side of her in hopes that she'd let me have my boy. One day she sent me on an errand. When I came back, mistress was counting a heap of bills in her lap. She was a rich woman. She rolled in gold. My little girl stood behind me behind the chair, and the mistress counted the money: $10, $20, $50. I see that she kept crying. I thought maybe that the mistress had struck her. I went up to her and whispered, 'What's the matter?' She pointed at the mistress's lap and said, 'Brother's money, brother's money.' Oh, then I understood it all. I said to the mistress, 'Miss Kinley, have you sold my boy?' Without looking up from counting her money, she drawled out, 'Yes, Charity, I got a great price for her.'" Sister Ross says, "Some Caucasoids that gave them religions called them Christian brothers and sisters." Oh, exactly, exactly. Some Caucasians that gave us religion call us brothers and sisters when they know very well the horrors that they wrought upon us and our people, and that they do not see us as their brothers and sisters. Historians of American slavery generally agree that it was common for slaveholders to sell slave children from their families. However, the typical age at which they were sold continues to be the subject of considerable debate. As mentioned previously, Frederick Bancroft found that mothers and their very young children were often exempt from separation. Fogel and Ingerman maintained that only 9.3% of the New Orleans sales were of children under the age of 13. They seem to have adopted the contention of Ulrich B. Phillips that young children were hardly ever sold separately, and the view that slaveholders sold slave children at ages when it would have been normal for them to have left their families. We can only speculate as to what Vogel and Ingerman meant by normal. Arguably, we might find it normal for a child to leave his family when he is emotionally secure enough to set out on his own. We might understand the normal circumstances under which a slaveholder's child of the age of 13 or 14 would have left his family on his own free will and having consulted with his parents, but we cannot say the same of the slave child. Neither he nor his parents were empowered to make decisions concerning his psychological or emotional preparedness for separation. Given the economic rationale for selling his slaves, the slaveholder's most important consideration in determining to sell a slave child would have been the child's salability. If he were convinced he would profit from the sale, the master would have sold that child. The owner of Lewis Hughes, for instance, sold him away from his mother at the young age of 6, hardly an age when a child would have reached emotional maturity. Mary Reynolds was just about big enough to start playing with a broom and sweeping up, not even half doing that when her master sold her. Jane Simpson was sold 6 times in her life, 3 times before she reached the age of 10. Samuel Ringgold Ward understood the calculating nature of the slaveholder and the criteria he applied in deciding when his young slave child was ready for the auction block. He wrote, However, this sickly boy, if practicable, must be raised for the auction mart. Now to sell his mother immediately depriving him of her tender care might endanger his life. And what was all important in his life was his salability. Who knows, but judging from the pedigree, it may prove to be a prime lot, rising 6 feet in length and weighing 220 pounds, more or less someday. Therefore, the sale was delayed. The young animal was to run a while longer. Accordingly, Bancroft, as a rule, there was a dividing line between slave children who were worth more with their mothers and those who were worth more without them. He drew a line at about 8 years of age. Bancroft cited the high prices young slave children commanded on the auction block as evidence that their sales were numerous. Vogel and Ingerman argued that the selling of a slave children under the age of 13 was infrequent, but Bancroft found that virtually all slave traders sold slave children from 10 to 12 years of age, and many slave traders advertised for those as young as 6 years of age. We know that the slave trader George Keffert placed an advertisement in the Alexandria Gazette indicating that he was willing to offer the highest cash price for slaves from 10 to 25 years of age. Matthew Bliss and Company, a slave trading company, advertised a bondwoman 24 years of age and her 2 children, one 8 and the other 3 years old. That means she had her first child at 16. Because if she was 24 and had an 8-year-old, she had her first child at 16. It is noteworthy that the company advised in the ad that the mother and her children will be sold separately or together as desired. At 9 years of age, Thomas H. Jones was snatched away from his only home, and his sister Sarah was sold soon after. Jones said that his poor mother never looked up after this final act of cruelty was accomplished. Moses Grady remembered 4 sisters and 4 brothers his mother had more children, but they were dead or sold away before he could remember them. Sojourner Truth, the second youngest child in her family, did not know the exact number of her siblings because her owner sold away all her older brothers and sisters before she was old enough to remember them. However, the 2 that immediately preceded her, a 5-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl, were sold away when she was only an infant. In writing about the breakup of slave families, some American historians depict humane homebreakers. They insist that moral, not economic, factors weighed in on the slaveholders' decision to separate slave family members. But the master's public relations strategy was merely to project the appearance of being humane. During the antebellum period, thousands of slaves, practically from East coastal states, particularly such as Maryland and Virginia, were annually exported to other slaveholding states. The thick traffic in slave trading during that period belies the claim that slaveholders agonized over separating slave family members. Indeed, the notion that the typical master was burdened by conscience is a fallacy. When slaveholders encouraged their slaves to pair up, it was generally to create slave labor, discourage runaways, and maintain discipline. Semi clad slave women were forced to procreate with men of their owners' choosing, were unfairly labeled as sexually promiscuous. But those slaves who voluntarily took on partners understood the value of monogamous unions in helping them to cope with the dehumanizing efforts of the American slavery regime. A desire for profit, however, precluded any slaveholders from respecting those unions. The breakup of slave marriages was widespread. During the antebellum period, slave sales were responsible for forcibly dissolving between 25 and 33% of all slave unions. First and foremost, slave marital arrangements had to satisfy the master's economic needs, and such bonds existed only so long as they served those needs. For many slave couples who were split up through sale, the consequences were emotionally devastating. Certain slaveholders encouraged slaves to take on new companions, and others compelled them to do it. But there was no more of a guarantee that the new relationship might not be dissolved by another sale. Slaveholders were not adverse to selling young slave children from their families. Even slave babies were snatched from their mother's breasts and sold away to traders. A slave child, 8 years of age or older, was probably worth more on the auction block without its mother. If convinced of profiting for the sale, the master would have sold that child. It was the money, the slave child's sellability, not the emotional preparedness for separation that mattered. Driven purely by their material interests, many slaveholders thought that Africans in America had no right to any family ties of their own. Countless Black people died heartbroken because of it. So, as you can see, they didn't care about us. They still don't care about us. They make us fatherless households and then they make fun of us for it. Can you imagine what they were doing to us back then? Sister Raw corrected herself. She said it's called Forks in the Road, not you. It's okay, Sister Raw. It's not a problem at all. But again, we have to think about this. They took suckling babes from their mothers. And sometimes those suckling babes that they took from their mothers were the product of rape. Sometimes those suckling babes were the product of a union that they destroyed because they sold her man off once she got pregnant. Sometimes they had paid college students to come and improve the stock. There's documented evidence that they actually paid college students to come south to rape enslaved women, to impregnate them, and paid them $20 each for each woman they impregnated. This is who we're dealing with. This is the history of it. These things happened. And we can't deny the fact that this legacy lives in us. That's why I talk about not being able to fully rock with what ADOS and FBA is talking about, because they want to say that there are new people, but there are new people that were created on a breeding farm. And I just can't accept that as my origin story. My history goes back so much further than that. I can't accept the idea that you want to lionize this interruption in my bloodline with these savages as my history, as my starting point. That can't be it. Because by saying you're ADOS or FBA or DOAS or whatever you want to say that says, I am a descendant of an enslaved person, then what you're saying is that's where my family started. And our families were already forcibly broken up, forcibly torn apart. Sometimes they would pair you with someone, and then once you got pregnant, or if they got mad, or if finances got too tight, they would tear you apart from that person that they forced you to be with in the first place. And then sometimes they would just have it set up so that you wouldn't even be eligible for marriage because you were too valuable a breeder. You would not be eligible for marriage or pairing up with another Black person because you were too fertile. And they wanted you to push out mulatto babies. They did that to us. It's talked about in the book, Slave Breeding in America by Smithers. Maybe we'll read that book after we go through the rebellions. All right, guys. I want to thank Sister Raw, Anthony McPhail, and the Forecast for being here. I know that Anthony McPhail is listening. I know that elders are listening with Sister Raw. I value you and I appreciate you for being here. I know that Justin Liebert is listening. KW Don 7 is listening. Koku is listening. Oni from the Pro-Black Perspective is listening. And so many others. Thank you, Shanique, for being here. I value each and every one of you. We have to remember this history. And we have to remember what they've done to us, because if we forget, then we begin to think that they're our friends, and we begin to think that they're just like us when they are not. Both races of people were epigenetically changed by the act of our enslavement, by the Ma'afa. We were both changed by that. They think that they have the right to question your presence wherever you are and get an answer. They think that they have the right to control your body, your movements, to touch you. They think that they have the right to impede upon your presence wherever you are, because white makes right in their mind's eye. But we have a long history of resistance. There's one more section of this book that I'll be reading tomorrow night at 7 p.m. And then we're going to start talking about the rebellions. Okay. I thank each and every one of you for being here. I value you, and I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Peace, guys.